In the dusty streets of Fort Worth, Texas, in 1878, where cattle drives and railroad wealth flowed like a river, there stood a saloon that locals spoke of in hushed tones. The Copper Bell wasn't just another bar for cowboys and wanderers. It was a place where desperate folks found astonishing remedies for ailments that had tormented them for years. Headaches that had plagued women since childbirth vanished after a single visit. Tuberculosis that had wiped out entire families seemed to fade like morning mist, and chronic pain that had hobbled strong men disappeared as if it had never existed. But on the night of October 15, 1878, 12 people died violently within its walls in what witnesses called a scene from hell itself. The official explanation satisfied no one who truly knew what happened in those blood-soaked hours. What the authorities never revealed, what surviving witnesses were too terrified to speak of, and what the town's most prominent families paid handsomely to keep buried was that Dr. Cornelius Weatherby had been serving his patrons far more than medicinal tonics. He had been conducting illegal human experiments, funded by pharmaceutical companies in the East who saw frontier towns as perfect testing grounds for compounds too dangerous for civilized populations. Fort Worth in 1878 was a city caught between two worlds, perched on the edge of civilization and the wild frontier that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. The Civil War's wounds were still raw, leaving the community divided between those who had backed the Confederacy and the growing number of northern investors eyeing Texas's vast cattle ranches and expanding railroads. Reconstruction had ended just 3 years earlier, but its effects lingered in the wary glances exchanged between old residents and newcomers, creating an atmosphere of mistrust that let secrets fester in the shadows. Into this divided town stepped Drive. Cornelius Weatherby, arriving from Dallas in the spring of 1877 on a morning when the prairie wind carried the scent of wildflowers mixed with the ever-present dust that coated everything in this fast-growing cattle hub. Weatherby stepped off the train with a worn leather medical bag, scarred from battlefield surgery, and a stack of recommendation letters from military hospitals in Virginia. These documents praised his service as a Union Army surgeon but were vague about the battles he'd seen or the horrors he'd endured saving lives. Standing over 6 feet tall, with graying hair at his temples and pale blue eyes that seemed to peer through people rather than at them, Weatherby cut a striking figure as he walked Fort Worth's muddy streets in his spotless black coat. His hands, folks later noticed, always trembled slightly, a condition he blamed on the strain of performing countless amputations under fire, though some who watched him closely suspected the shaking stemmed from darker causes. His credentials were impressive enough for a frontier town desperate for proper medical care. The local doctor, Marcus Gilliland, was overwhelmed by the needs of a booming population, and the arrival of a trained military surgeon seemed like a godsend to families who'd lost loved ones to treatable ailments. Weatherby's references boasted of innovative treatments and experimental methods that had saved lives when standard medicine failed, exactly the kind of advanced knowledge Fort Worth's ambitious residents believed their town deserved. But instead of setting up a traditional practice, Weatherby made a choice that surprised many but thrilled the town's business leaders. He bought a large 2-story building on Main Street, right across from the First National Bank, and announced plans to turn the ground floor into a saloon while running his medical practice from the rooms upstairs and behind. He named it the Copper Bell, hanging a real ship's bell made of polished copper above the entrance, its clear tone ringing through the business district whenever the wind caught it just right. The idea of combining a medical practice with a bar raised eyebrows, but Weatherby explained it with a logic that impressed Fort Worth's educated folks. He argued that alcohol had legitimate medical uses when carefully administered and that a saloon's friendly atmosphere offered mental health benefits that aided healing. Patients who might shy away from a cold doctor's office would feel at ease in a warm, welcoming place where they could talk openly about their troubles while sipping drinks that were part of their treatment. The Copper Bell's main floor boasted a long mahogany bar shipped from New Orleans at great expense, its polished surface glowing under brass fixtures that shone even in the dim light of oil lamps. The place was fancier than most frontier bars, with carpeted floors, wallpaper showing peaceful countryside scenes, and furniture that wouldn't have looked out of place in a street Louis hotel. But it was the back room, behind a heavy oak door marked private consultation, that made the Copper Bell unlike any saloon between Dallas and El Paso. Behind that door, Weatherby had built what looked like a top-notch medical facility, the kind that would have impressed doctors in big eastern cities. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with brown bottles holding tinctures, powders, and strange liquids that shimmered like amber in the lamplight. A large desk sat in one corner, always covered with medical journals, letters in several languages, and Weatherby's precise handwritten notes tracking symptoms, treatments, and results with scientific rigor. The room had a peculiar smell, a mix of medicinal herbs, pure alcohol, and something sharp and chemical that folks couldn't quite place but that clung to their clothes long after they left. Some likened it to the stench of battlefield hospitals, others thought it smelled like the chemical plants springing up in northern industrial districts. Weatherby's approach to medicine was unlike anything Fort Worth had seen. He blended traditional remedies with experimental techniques he claimed to have learned from European doctors pushing the boundaries of science. He spent hours with each patient, asking not just about their symptoms but their family history, daily routines, emotions, and deepest fears about their health. He used instruments that seemed more advanced than anything Gilliland owned, gleaming metal tools with precise measurements that looked more like scientific equipment than medical devices. But what really set Weatherby apart, and drew crowds from across North Texas, was his treatment method. Instead of sending patients home with bottles of medicine, where he couldn't watch their effects or adjust doses, he insisted they take their treatments right there in the saloon under his direct supervision. He called these sessions therapeutic consultations, and they quickly turned into social events that attracted not just patients but curious onlookers eager to see what many called medical miracles. The treatments were specially mixed drinks, prepared fresh for each patient with ingredients measured like a chemist. These concoctions varied wildly in appearance, from pale amber liquids that looked like fine whiskey to deep green mixtures that seemed to glow faintly. Their effects were astonishing to those who'd never seen such rapid health improvements. Martha Caldwell, a seamstress whose crippling headaches started after her husband's death in a railroad accident 6 months earlier, said a single dose of Weatherby's neural tonic erased her pain completely for the first time since her loss. Samuel Hutchins, a wealthy cattleman whose arthritis had left him barely able to ride, reported that Weatherby's joint elixir restored his mobility to levels he hadn't known in over a decade. Word of these cures spread fast in frontier towns hungry for hope. Cowboys on the cattle trails to Kansas detoured to visit the Copper Bell, seeking relief from old injuries. Railroad workers, worn down by years of grueling labor, pooled their wages for Weatherby's treatments. Even Fort Worth's elite, like the wife of bank president Theodore Bancroft and the mother of cattle baron Harrison Wade, became regulars. The atmosphere during these consultations was unlike anything else in town. Patients arrived looking worn and hopeless, their faces etched with years of pain or illness. But within hours of drinking Weatherby's mixtures, they transformed, laughing freely, talking excitedly about dreams they'd abandoned, and radiating an energy that bordered on euphoric. Regulars started showing up even when they weren't sick, claiming they needed Weatherby's tonics to stay healthy and vigorous. By the summer of 1878, the Copper Bell was Fort Worth's most popular spot, drawing crowds that spilled onto Main Street and created a festive vibe that boosted business across downtown. Weatherby hired extra staff to handle the rush. Jonas Kerr, a seasoned bartender who'd worked saloons from San Antonio to Dallas, and 2 serving girls, Rebecca Howe and Eleanor Finch, daughters of local farmers who saw the Copper Bell as a chance to earn better wages while witnessing its fascinating medical work. But even as Weatherby's fame grew, some sharp-eyed locals noticed troubling patterns. Patients who saw dramatic improvements often returned more frequently, saying their symptoms came back worse if they missed treatments. Families noticed loved ones growing secretive and irritable away from the saloon, obsessed with their next visit while neglecting home and work. Dr. Gilliland, who'd initially welcomed Weatherby's help, saw signs of physical dependence in regular patients, symptoms worse than laudanum addiction, with unpredictable effects he'd never encountered in his years treating opium-dependent folks. The first major incident hit in August 1878, when cattle driver Pete Garrison collapsed outside the Copper Bell after drinking a pulmonary restorative meant to clear his lungs of trail dust. Witnesses said he convulsed violently, eyes rolled back, foam pouring from his mouth as his body twisted unnaturally. He was dead before Gilliland could arrive. When the local constable questioned Weatherby, the doctor calmly produced a note claiming Garrison had a pre-existing heart condition that made him unfit for treatment. The explanation seemed plausible enough to close the case, but witnesses swore Garrison looked healthy moments before drinking, and his death didn't resemble any heart failure they'd seen. More unsettling was Weatherby's reaction. He seemed more interested in studying Garrison's body and jotting notes about his symptoms than mourning the loss. 2 weeks later, another death cracked the Copper Bell's reputation. Martha Caldwell, the seamstress who'd praised Weatherby's cures, was found dead in her home after missing several appointments. Neighbors heard her screaming the night before, claiming spiders were crawling under her skin and begging for help to remove them. When her body was found, she'd clawed deep gashes into her arms and face, her expression frozen in terror. The official report called it nervous exhaustion, a vague term that avoided hard questions. But those who saw her body, including Gilliland, knew it couldn't explain the severity of her injuries or the agony she'd endured, fighting hallucinations that felt utterly real. These deaths stirred doubts among Fort Worth's thoughtful citizens, but the Copper Bell's economic benefits, jobs, supplies, and visitors kept the town's leaders from digging too deep. Mayor William Crawford, whose wife relied on Weatherby for insomnia relief, was especially reluctant to probe further. As autumn deepened and the cattle season slowed, the Copper Bell's atmosphere grew tense. Regulars needed stronger doses for the same effects, and Weatherby started testing new formulas, receiving shipments from Chicago, New York, and overseas, crates marked medical supplies containing strange substances and equipment unlike anything locals had seen. October 15, 1878, began like any busy evening at the Copper Bell, with regulars settling in under the warm glow of oil lamps. But by dawn, 12 people lay dead, their bodies strewn across the blood-soaked floor, and survivors carried memories too horrific to speak aloud. The day had been unusually warm for mid-October, with temperatures nearing 80 degrees and humidity that made tempers flare. Storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising a thunderstorm that could turn streets to mud and shake buildings with its fury. Weatherby seemed unusually excited, his pale eyes gleaming with an intensity his staff later called almost manic. Jonas Kerr noticed him moving crates with extreme care, refusing help and saying their contents were too delicate. "Tonight will be special," Weatherby told his staff. "I've developed a new formula that will free patients from daily treatments, restoring their health for good." The crowd that night was unlike any other, packed with Fort Worth's elite, including Mayor Crawford, railroad man Thomas Benedict, and merchant James Fairfax, alongside regulars like Harrison Wade and Martha Ellsworth. Even Drive. Gilliland attended, curious about Weatherby's revolutionary methods. As the storm raged outside, Weatherby announced a community therapeutic intervention, serving his new formula to everyone at once to create a shared healing experience. He used strange crystalline powders and compounds from his crates, producing drinks with an oily, blue-green tint and a sharp chemical smell. Despite hesitations, the crowd's excitement and Weatherby's confidence convinced them to drink. The effects hit fast and were unlike anything before. Some laughed uncontrollably, others stared at objects in a trance. Soon, behaviors turned sinister. Mayor Crawford rambled incoherently, Harrison Wade accused strangers of conspiracies, and Samuel Hutchins clawed at his skin, screaming about insects. Martha Ellsworth threw herself against windows, convinced the walls were closing in. Gilliland, who'd sipped cautiously, tried to help but was disoriented. The saloon became a battlefield, furniture smashed, glass broke, and blood pooled as rational people turned violent. Thomas Benedict attacked James Fairfax with a bottle, and Harrison Wade swung a surgical saw, killing bystanders in his delusion. Weatherby locked himself in his consultation room, muttering and laughing as chaos reigned. By dawn, 12 were dead, 8 were gravely injured, and survivors sat catatonic amid the carnage. Constable Robert Hayes and Sheriff Daniel Murphy led the investigation, but pressure from town leaders like Crawford stifled it. Weatherby was cleared, retreating to a house outside town. Survivors deteriorated, Hutchins suffered seizures, Ellsworth saw shrinking walls, and others reported nightmares of Weatherby's eyes and crawling insects. Even their families showed symptoms, like Hutchins's son with memory blackouts and Ellsworth's sister with scratching marks, despite never visiting the Copper Bell. In February 1879, Margaret Henley, sister of victim James Fairfax, arrived from Chicago with evidence of Weatherby's experiments. A telegraph operator, she'd uncovered his purchases of toxic compounds and payments from Eastern companies like Hammond Chemical Works for human testing data. Her findings threatened Fort Worth's leaders, who resisted her inquiries. Dr. Gilliland, shown her evidence, realized the massacre was no accident but deliberate poisoning. On March 10, 1880, Eleanor Finch revealed Weatherby's plan to poison the Cattlemen's Association gathering. Margaret and Gilliland warned some attendees, but Weatherby had already tainted the town's water supply, causing widespread symptoms. Margaret was found dead days later, ruled a suicide despite foul play. Gilliland had a breakdown and died in an asylum. Weatherby vanished, leaving notes on experiments across the West. The Copper Bell was demolished, but its site stayed barren, and locals swore they heard screams on quiet nights. Fort Worth grew, but the truth of the Copper Bell lingered, a chilling reminder of science twisted into horror. Could such experiments have happened in frontier America, hidden in plain sight? The isolation and ambition of towns like Fort Worth made them perfect for dark secrets. The Copper Bell's story warns us that progress can mask evil, destroying free will under the guise of healing.